friends. It's Lisa. I am joining Cooper today for the Tavern Talk for October. Hi.
Yay. Hi.
Yay. Hi. So we have both, I think it's fair to say, noticed over time. And before we get started, I do want to give a small disclaimer that typically during the Tavern Talks, I am somewhere other than with Cooper, keeping our dogs quiet with dog treats. Obviously, that's not happening today. So if you hear a round of amens from somewhere in the form of a bark, I apologize in advance. But back to the Tavern Talk. So one thing that Cooper and I have talked a lot about over the last several weeks in particular are the various things that we are seeing on social media. And unless you live in a bubble, you are likely seeing the same. As we all know, it is an election cycle. And we are seeing that play out in our various forms of social media. And we decided that there was no better time to talk about some of those things. Agreed?
Agreed. Yeah, some of these posts that I've seen and you've seen are things like, it's time for we Christians to stand up and make sure our voice is heard, or we need to do the Christian thing and vote. And a lot of those things could be taken more than one way. And so, as you learn your Facebook friends and their political leanings, I find that what they meant by that may be different than what I would mean saying the same thing. So it seemed like a great time to write something about how does our faith, how does Christianity fit into politics?
Right. Now, that's not an easy conversation to have. This is not an easy Tavern Talk, which is why we're doing it together. And so with that in mind, and because I am not a student of history necessarily, we're going to take a historical look at this for a little bit, but Cooper's going to do that.
Well, I think you have to look at it from a historical context. I mean, anytime you try to apply biblical writings to life today, you got to do that. But politics is something wholly different, and I think we really have to look at it from our nation's history's standpoint, because as the title of this piece says, Jesus wasn't American. So what does it mean to be American? Well, historically, let's look at the founding of our nation, right? So there were really two major groups that were involved in settling here. Not originally, that would be the Native Americans, more about them in a minute. But the other two groups that came from Europe were here to find a place to practice religious freedom where they could believe and live out their faith without government interference. And they weren't necessarily mainstream either. I mean, these are people who ended up drowning witches, right? So anyway, but they came here with pure thoughts in their mind. And then the other group really wanted, they didn't care perhaps so much about the religious freedom, they wanted economic freedom. The freedom to generate revenue for themselves, or to generate revenue for a king or queen back home, which would, inure to their benefit as well. So you got to look at that context. And in spite of some of the failings of our founding fathers, one thing they got right was separating church and state. And so that meant the government stays out of religion and religion stays out of the government. And that was a great theory.
Correct. So what happened?
So we really haven't done that very well, have
No.
we? I mean, while we have founded a country based on these individual freedoms, religion, economic, etc., mostly for white men, but that's beside the point. In principle, it is juxtapositioned with a tension because our country is also founded by people and majority rules, right? So you got majority rules competing with those independent individual freedoms, and so our religious beliefs have perhaps wormed their way into our politics, and not always in a good way. So if you think about some of the black eyes that we have as a nation, a lot of them were supported and maintained and defended with the excuse or defense of biblical things really taken out of context with what being a Christian is.
Right.
Whether it's the way we treated Native Americans because they were, savages in the mind of the founding fathers. So we ran them off their land with a Bible in one hand and a gun in the other. All under the idea of saving them, or really expanding our own interests. Slavery was the same way. People, used biblical passages to support the idea of slavery. The oppression of women, that people used biblical principles for that. Civil rights. I mean, we had to have a civil rights movement in the 60s? Really? I mean, our Constitution already laid these things out, and if we had Christian values, would we really need that, right? But we did. And then just keep moving forward to, the criminalization and oppression of people based on their sexual preferences or sexual practices. I mean, all of this has been by the government, but really had religious underpinnings. So we haven't done a good job of separating church and state, or keeping religion out of politics and politics out of religion, but it's a great principle.
It is, yes. Okay, so given that it is a great principle and sort of the goal, how can we turn this sort of on its ear? What's the good way that we can allow our faith, in fact, to inform our government, if you will?
So I think with most things as Christians, we come with questions because we are human and we have our own thoughts, desires, and ideals. And I think politics plays a part in, or religion plays a part in politics in really two ways. There's one big picture, macro way, right? The government and religion and the government, that's what we talked about. But what about from an individual perspective? What do we do about our individual religious practices or beliefs and how they affect our relationship to the government? So there's really two big questions, right? And so as Christians, what do we look to provide us guidance, but what did Jesus do? So,
right.
The old bracelet, what would Jesus do? Let's look at what did Jesus do? And so in order to look at what Jesus did, again, you've got to take it in context of what he was dealing with in first century Palestine. So back then, there were really two governing authorities for the Jews in Judea, in Palestine, and one was religious in basis. You had religious leaders with what was then the church, or what not known as such, but they had very strict rules, and you had to follow them in traditions and practices, and they had a governing authority. So that was one group, and then the other group was the civil government, which by the time Jesus was an adult, was by Rome, who had its governor in place to rule from a civil perspective. So let's look at what Jesus did, what Jesus said about those two governing authorities. So first, let's look at the religious one. Jesus was not shy about pointing out how they were getting it wrong. But he did it in a little bit of an indirect way, right? I mean, he respected and appreciated practices, traditions, and rules, but not when they ran counter to those things that God really wanted us to do, which was love each other and love him. So Jesus broke the rules to heal a man with a crippled hand on the Sabbath, which was against the rules, but it was compassionate. Jesus allowed his followers to gather grain to eat on the Sabbath, again against the rules, but they were hungry, they needed to eat. That made sense. But what he didn't do was mount some overthrow of the religious leaders. Could he have done that? Sure. I mean, he came with all the authority that God had over this planet. He could have done that, but he didn't do that. He didn't lead any insurrection. He didn't mount, a violent overthrow of the religious leaders. It didn't do it. And I think that's interesting. So that's the religious leaders. What about the civil leaders? Well, he took them on even less so. He never really spoke, that we know of, against the civil leaders. And he didn't say much about it. What he did say was he paid his taxes. There was a tax when they had gathered some fish in a foreign land. They owed a tax to the government. They paid it. And then he was confronted by the Pharisees at some point, again, always trying to catch him in some trick. And they show him a coin that was produced by the Roman government and say, what are we supposed to do with this? Do we pay taxes to Caesar or do we give it to God? And Jesus, again, without a direct answer, says, well, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar, and to God that which is God. And that's really it. That's all he said about that civil government. So we don't have much guidance, or do we?
I would say yes.
Yes, so we do. Well, there's more to the New Testament, right?
Yes.
Because we've also got some great books and letters that Jesus' followers produced.
So let's talk about Peter and Paul.
Yeah, so Peter and Paul. Paul, the most prolific of the writers, but Peter touched on this as well. So Paul, who was part of the Jewish hierarchy until he saw the light, literally, and became a follower of Jesus, wrote in a letter to the Romans, which you can find in Romans, about what those believers in Rome should do with respect to the government. And
Should
this
I read
is
it?
from, sure, if you want to, Romans 13, chapters 1 through 6. Or verses.
Oh, I was about to say, no, I'm not reading. No, we're not reading the entire book of Romans. This is Romans chapter 13, verses 1 through 6. Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do what you want to be free from fear of the one in authority, then do what is right, and you will be commended. For the one in authority is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid. For rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. Therefore, it is necessary to submit to the authorities, not only because of possible punishment, but also as a matter of conscience. This is also why you pay taxes. For the authorities are God's servants who give their full time to governing. Give to everyone what you owe them. If you owe taxes, pay taxes. If revenue, then revenue. If respect, then respect. If honor, then honor.
So Paul writes to the Christians in Rome and says, the authorities that exist have been established by God. So a lot of Americans, especially historically, who want to wrap patriotism and religion together, have pointed to this passage and the one from Peter we can talk about next. That so God's appointed this authority, so you should submit yourself fully. Well, again, context, and I think let's talk about what Peter said, because we can talk about them together. So Peter in 1 Peter chapter 2 is writing to some of the early churches which were in other provinces. So Peter was in Rome, and he's writing to these churches that are off in what is now Turkey. And they were being persecuted by the leaders and the rulers in the lands where they were. And so the whole letter that we have in 1 Peter is writing them to urge them to remain faithful. That's the context of 1 Peter.
Okay.
So he says this in verse 13, chapter 2 of 1 Peter. Submit yourself for the Lord's sake to every human authority, whether to the emperor as the supreme authority, or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. Live as free people, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as God's slaves. Show proper respect to everyone. Love the family of believers. Fear God. Honor the emperor. So they really say the same thing. Separately, separated by years, separated by geography. They're saying the same thing to these early minority Christians who, regardless of whether they were in Rome or outside of Rome, were not in power, right? And so what Peter and Paul are saying is, don't worry about what your local government is doing to you, because there's nothing you can do about it. God can do something about it, but what you can control is what you need to focus on, and that's your relationship with each other and your relationship with God. The two principal commandments, as Jesus told us: love your neighbor as yourself, love God before everything else. So what Peter and Paul were basically saying, not inconsistent with what Jesus said and did, is why don't we, you as Christians, focus on those things rather than worrying about government in the big picture? So if we take what Jesus said and did, what Peter and Paul said and did, and try to figure out what we're to do, you've got to translate it back into today's time.
Okay, so what do we do?
Well, our government is much different than that which existed back then for them. And it was, new on the scene 200 plus years ago. So our government is a government of the people and by the people. And so we formed government based on certain principles. It wasn't forced on us.
Right.
In principle, it was forced on some people because not everybody had a say, but more people had a say than did back then when you had no say.
Sure.
Right?
But in fairness, our government was developed primarily for the white man.
Yeah,
white man.
Absolutely. But not by a family and not by
right.
force.
Certainly.
Right?
Certainly.
So, but part of what we wanted to do with government was ensure these individual freedoms, political, economic, religious. And provide for our common good. So we needed government to have rules. We needed to have law and order in order to ensure that people could have those individual freedoms, even if they were in a minority.
Right.
And we also pooled our resources just because economically it made more sense for the common good. It doesn't make sense for everybody to have their own fire department, right? So, we work together as a group. We can't all build roads somewhere, so we work together as a group. And that's part of what our government did. So now what do we do with that in the context of what we have from Jesus, Peter, and Paul? It's much different. I don't think we can check our religious beliefs at the door, right? So we can use our religious beliefs, our faith, to inform our decisions as we exercise those individual freedoms. The right to vote, the right to speak out, the right to assemble. We can do all those things because our government, because we ourselves said those rights are important and we can do them. So if we're going to do them, while we separate religion and government as big picture items, we can only do them individually through the lens and with the hands of Jesus.
Which is love.
Absolutely. That's the answer. So if we're to pursue our faith as Christians, I don't think that means that we use government to try to impose what our beliefs are on others simply because we may be in the majority. And I'm not sure that we necessarily are anymore, or that we ever necessarily were. I mean, who's to say? But, I mean, you can't legislate, you can't force people to be Christian. I mean, think about it. From the beginning of our relationship with God, God gave us free will. That starts in Genesis, right? He wants us to choose him. He doesn't force us to choose him.
Right.
Jesus comes along with all the authority and the power of God right here on the planet. And what does he do? Does he force people to follow God?
No.
No. He gives them the tools by which they can choose to follow God. And by following God, you have to love each other. So I think for Christians, what that tells us with our government, much different than what Jesus was dealing with in his time, Peter and Paul and theirs, what we do with our government is not use it to force our beliefs on others, but use it to do good. Use it to, as we pool our resources together, provide for the common good. That's right in our Constitution. But we do it with love. And that common good is measured by love. What would you want done for you?
Right.
Right? Then that's what we do for others. Maybe it's a tough balance because we've also got to be able to protect our right to practice that religion freely. So government needs to provide law and order so that we can do that, both on an international scene and a national scene. But you've got to balance that with the right and the need as Christians to love each other.
Right.
So
that's the goal. That, I mean, goes all back to what we talk about here and what you and I have discussed for so many years about. It goes back to love the Lord your God with,
the two big commandments.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
It's
every
the answer
time.
to everything.
It really is.
And unfortunately, historically, because we're human and our government is by the people, for the people who are also human, greed has gotten in the way.
Sure.
Greed for money, greed for power, greed for adoration, greed for, that's our sinful nature. But that doesn't mean that we don't have that as an aspirational goal to lead us. So when people say, it's our Christian duty to vote, it's our Christian duty to love each other.
Correct.
If we're going to use our vote to further those principles, great.
It's our American duty to
vote. Right.
It's our Christian duty to love one another.
Yeah.
And just to sort of wrap all of this up, in short, it goes back to the title of what we've called this, and that's Jesus wasn't American.
Right. Which is just a fact.
It's simply a fact. That's right. But we have great opportunity in both our faith and in our American citizenship to exercise terrific rights and to exercise terrific opportunity through the betterment of both.
Right.
Through the betterment of our faith, through the betterment of our country, those are two fantastic opportunities, but two very different things.
Yeah, yeah. So a lot of people will see perhaps the title "Jesus was an American" and they get offended.
Correct. They will.
Well, what is there to be offended by? It's just a fact. And though Jesus wasn't American, he would and probably does appreciate the fact that we have the ability to do so much more through our country, through our rights, for more people than the oppressed Christians did in the first century.
Right.
The question is, are we doing that as he would want us to? You know, the big question when I see those posts about America and what it means to be an American, and as a Christian we've got to do these things, I've come close to responding, you know, what would Jesus do? What would Jesus say? And for some of those people, that would be a difficult answer because it would be inconsistent with how they might practice their vote,
right,
and their citizenship. So I think it's a great opportunity to further our Christian values. And separating church from state, religion from government, government from religion does not mean that when we go to the ballot box, we check our Christian values at the door. But our Christian values are to love one another,
right,
not to impose our beliefs on others.
That is correct. Yes.
So we're going to post this, I don't know what you call it, piece, paper.
Yeah, this, what you've been watching me refer back to, constantly making sure that I'm following along and hitting all the high points.
On our website. So after you've seen this discussion, maybe you want to read it, and maybe you don't. I don't know, but maybe they can inform each other. But look for that, and I welcome your thoughts. I mean, I think it'd be neat to
in a healthy way. We welcome your thoughts.
Absolutely.
in a way that is respectful.
Yeah, and I certainly, that's what was intended.
Absolutely. Oh, for certain. And one of the things that I have been saying on a personal level for the last several weeks is that I am, for myself, praying very intentionally about a November 4th self, what to do the day following our elections. And today, with this in mind, with our friends in mind, with the world in mind, I want to extend that prayer to pray for a November 4th nation and world, because, you know, the sun is going to come up on that day, and we are still going to have these same conversations, and we're still going to have these same sorts of opportunities to love one another. And so I challenge all of us to pray about that November 4th attitude, whatever way.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, and to approach it both as Christians and Americans in a way that is humble and graceful and I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's interesting you said as Christians and Americans, because they're not the same thing.
No, they're not. They're truly not.
Yeah.
So, anyway,
Awesome.
So we've done well with time.
Oh, good.
Hallelujah. What a blessing. So, thank you.
So next month, stay tuned.
Yeah.
Who knows?
So next month, I think, is actually on the first day of November.
Yeah, maybe so.
Yeah. So we'll meet again before, and we'll look forward to seeing you all. So, thanks. Thanks for being with us today. And the dogs were very cooperative. Also a blessing. Have a great fall.